Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. Today I'm going to give you some advice on waterfowl and duck photography, including 5 tips that you don't want to miss, and we'll get to it right after this. So we're going to discuss waterfowl photography. We're going to talk a little bit about why it's so challenging to do, but also why it can be so rewarding. And to speak to the rewarding part, I want to show you this. I'm going to show you my Instagram account. I was looking at engagement. Instagram in general has become a little bit odd, and I stumbled on this screen and I noticed this theme. The theme was these were my most popular or my most engaging images over the last year. The vast majority were waterfowl. I didn't realize that at the time, but it made me think about how, when it's well done, how well it can be received, how popular it can be, and also just for me personally, how much I enjoy doing it and I enjoy the results. So without any further ado, I'm going to take you over to my Flickr page. Now this is under S Keys Images. The reason I like to do this is a public album, so anybody can watch or view this. So if you want to go over to S Keys Images, you'll see an album called Ducks for YouTube, and that's what this video is going to be based off. I'm going to show you a lot of examples for each of these tips to hopefully reinforce how this tip can be applied and the results that you can get from it. So without any further ado, let's jump into tip number 5. So the first tip I have for you is just to understand the types of ducks or waterfowl that you're dealing with. Just like so many things in wildlife photography, behavior becomes so important. I've got a video that I did a couple years ago on predictive behavior for wildlife photography. I think it's a good video. It's a little bit long, but it gives you some examples of how you can predict behavior to put yourself in a better position as a photographer. Now with ducks or waterfowl, there's 2 basic types of ducks. You don't have to know every species, but what can be very helpful is to know how they behave. So for example, if you've got dabbling ducks, they're going to stay typically on the surface of the water and have their heads down. They don't offer a lot of great photographic opportunities in that position. And they often work in flocks, not all the time, but often you'll see them congregating in groups. Diving ducks would be the other category, or just divers in general. That would include most grebes and loons. And when you're dealing with those species, you actually can change your approach much differently. So when a diving duck goes underwater, they will eventually come up. But then that time that they're underwater, it gives you a unique opportunity to approach. So if you're patient and you study the behavior a little bit, you may actually be able to work your way all the way up to the edge of the water. So tip number 5 really just involves the type of species that you're working with and understanding the behaviors within those groups of ducks or waterfowl. That ties into tip number 4. And tip number 4 is that size matters. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the size of the individuals that you're photographing. It actually means the size of the flock. We often see large flocks and think, oh, this is great. There's a lot of ducks there. But for a photographer, that's almost detrimental. As soon as you alert 1 or 2 ducks, they tend to push away and it alerts the whole flock. Sometimes they'll even fly out or fly off and the whole group will fly off. And so what looked like a really great opportunity turns into absolutely nothing. And once they're flushed and alert, it may take a long time for them to come back. So understanding numbers can be important in how to utilize numbers. I'm going to show you some examples of taking tips number 4 and 5 and putting them together. So here I've got a diving duck. This is a horned grebe in its non-breeding plumage. And I had a single individual. And I saw this individual from the parking lot. I used binoculars. I didn't get too close. And I watched him as he was diving up and down. Then what I did is I actually drove the car a little closer. As he's underwater, I pulled up a little bit more and stopped. He went under again, and I did the same thing till I could park. I repeated the same behavior while he was underwater as I did my dive and dash. And dive and dash simply means when he's underwater, I'm going to scooch up to the shoreline a little bit and maybe lay down, anticipating that he'll return soon. And I repeat that process till I'm up to the edge of the water. This is the same duck. And I stayed with this duck this grebe for probably 10, 15 minutes. And each time he was underwater, I would move into a better position, sometimes getting in front of him, predicting where he would be. And he would come back up under the water and float in front of me. And I would repeat that process until I got a few images that I liked. I'm going to show you another example of this. I saw this bird as I was walking, and I was behind some marsh grass. So I fortunately had some concealment, and I noticed that they were diving. So in that process, I moved into a position in front of where they were headed, parked myself around the marsh grass, used it as cover, and this horned grebe floated right in front of me. Images that I really, really like, but use that predictive behavior, understanding how they would dive and how long they'd be underwater to time my movement to the water. So understanding that behavior was really, really important. And one last diver, this is a rare bird locally. This is a red-necked grebe. And I was able to get extremely close to this one doing the exact same thing. I actually watched from my car. When they were underwater, I got out of my car, used it as a blind. When they went under again, I got up to the edge of the lake. When they went under again, I got in position. I just took my time, was patient. Doesn't always work, but it can. When you're dealing with larger groups or flocks, it can be a little bit tougher. Those flocks will often push things away from the edge. So my advice is, and my tip here is, when you're dealing with flocks and you understand how they behave, you're going to have to approach much, much differently. You're not going to walk up to the edge of a lake with a flock of ducks unless they are tamed and used to being fed. Then you may get lucky there. But what you need to think about is, how do I get into position to shoot this flock at some point? And often using some sort of barrier. Maybe you're around the corner on a lake, or maybe you've got some cover like tall marsh grasses that you can use, but you've got to have some sort of concealment to get up to the edge of the lake. And it's much, much different. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about location in a minute. And that's where working with flocks really becomes important, is understanding the locations and finding locations that work really well when you're dealing with larger groups of ducks. And now let's talk about tip number 3, which is perspective. With almost all wildlife, eye level engagement will create better images. Now, that's not to say it's the only perspective that works, but in general, it's a perspective that works very, very well. And there's a couple reasons for it. I'm going to talk about the engagement first, and then I'm going to talk about the actual perspective and the benefits to the photograph from an environmental standpoint. But let's just talk about engagement. Here's a wood duck at eye level, a very powerful portrait because you are just connected to the bird. Your attention goes nowhere except to the eyes. Now, if you were shooting down on this, it would create a couple of other problems. One is it's not going to feel like you're in the same focal plane, so you're not eye to eye. And just think about that when you're speaking with somebody who might be a lot taller than you or a lot shorter than you. It changes the dynamic of how you might feel. When you're on the same level as somebody, it tends to create a different feeling, a much more engaged feeling. So the first reason we use perspective is for engagement. Now, the second reason we use it is to basically just create better environmental shots. I did a video on low angle photography, and obviously these ducks are on the water, so your lens needs to be very low to the ground. So check out my video on low angle photography. I'll put a card up here, and you'll see how to set up in those low angle situations and some of the ones that I use. I also have a video on ball head photography where I show another method of using a ball head to get a low angle, so you can check that video out as well. But here, the advantage of perspective isn't so much about engagement. It's about seeing through to the far shoreline. So I get separation from the subject to the background, but I also incorporate background that I wouldn't get at a different angle. Imagine this same bird being photographed down at an angle, and the only thing I would have is water. So I would see the top of the head, and then I would just see water in the foreground and water in the background. To me, not nearly as pretty as these nice marsh grasses back here, and even a little bit of color in the clouds up above. I'll show you a couple more examples of this. This is a really low angle. Very, very low to the ground on this one, probably just an inch or two over the water. And you could see I'm actually the head of the duck, unlike this buffle head where the head's in the water, right? And the marsh grasses are above. Look at this one. The head of the duck is actually in the marsh grasses, and that's because of that really low perspective that's achieved. It gives a different look, it creates really nice separation, and includes a little bit more habitat. So especially with waterfowl, where the water may not be the prettiest part of the scene, we can use low angles and perspective to improve the overall image. And then just the separation that you can get here. So look at how flat the water is, and then that distant shoreline way behind this wood duck creates a really pretty mood. So tip number 3 is to get low perspective, as low as you can get comfortably. And check out the other videos that reference how to do that. But getting there can be a challenge, and we'll talk about that next. And here's the challenge. How do you get to these low angle areas without being seen? And that's where locations come in. So tip number 2 is locations. probably more important than the subjects themselves. Waterfowl sometimes will be very consistent. You'll get the same species at the same area all the time. During a migratory period, anything can show up. And especially during those migratory periods, the location is much more important than the subject. You don't really know what's going to be there, but this hooded merganser could be any species. And it's going to look good because in this location, I've got very nice morning light. And I've also got the ability to get to the edge of this small pond without being seen. Now, to do that, there's a couple tricks. The first is in this location and several others, I'm going to get there before the sun comes up. I know there's a lot of hobbyist photographers out there that are not excited about the idea of getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning, going to a lake and trying to be set up on the ground, low angle by the time the sun comes up. But I'm actually trying to get in these locations before the sun comes up. So maybe 15 minutes or a half an hour. I've also got a video on blue hour photography, so you can take advantage of some of those blue hour tones as well, even with waterfowl. Locations are critical for waterfowl photography. There aren't a ton of perfect areas, but if you scout and you look, you can find these places that actually you can get to the water. This is the same pond, but you can see the types of looks I'm getting here. This is a different location, much different than the first hooded merganser I showed you. This hooded merganser is in a location where they come around the corner. You're on a little bit of a landmass that sticks out, and you've got ponds on either side. And as they're going from one side to the other, every now and then they just drift in front of the camera. This look is probably only about 12 or 15 feet away. Again, I'm using the low angle. I know this location photographs well in the morning light. Location, location, location. I do have a video on location sharing, and I'll put this out there as a note, just my personal beliefs on location sharing. I don't share locations. There are, in some areas, a lot of photographers around and a lot of birders. And if I've got a location that photographs well for me, I'm not just trying to protect the location and just trying to protect the species. There's a selfish component to this, and I make no bones about it. If I've got a great spot for waterfowl locally, and they're very, very hard to come by, these little isolated patches that photograph really, really well, and you can get concealment and all the other things that it takes to get some of these shots. I don't want everybody knowing about them because I may go there and there's other photographers, and they may not be as quiet, and they may not be as ethical, and they may not, take the time and energy. And what I'd hate to do is get up at 4:30 in the morning, drive an hour, set up before sunrise, and then just as I'm about to start shooting, I hear footsteps behind me and everything flushes off. So I do kind of keep these spots to myself, especially for waterfowl, because they are very, very difficult to find. I wanted to show you this because at this location, I can go in the fall, November, late October, and I know that I'm going to get colors in the background. Regardless of the species, I'm going to get color in the background. In this location, I know in the early morning, the sun's going to hit these marsh grasses and really light them up, as you can see here with this red-breasted merganser. I know that's going to happen regardless of the species. I know that this is a predictable location, and I also know that I can get to it. And when I get in, I know I've got concealment around me, but I do have to get in normally before sunrise here because there's a large flock that likes this area. Again, getting back to the size of the flock. When you see large flocks, you know they like an area, but you're going to have to get in early enough in the morning or in the afternoon that if you do push them away from the shoreline, you can give them time to get adjusted and come back. If you wait to just at sunrise in the best light and you've pushed some away, they may not come back for another half hour to an hour. And in that case, the light might be gone by then. So locations, locations, locations. I'm going to show you a couple more from another spot. All of these, the same spot. And you can see where the background is catching some of that evening light. So in this location, I shoot in the evenings because the sun is going to hit that far shoreline and give me a certain look. And then one more location. This is another different location. And in this case, I'm using marsh grass to approach. So I can actually walk right up to the edge of the lake. There's a lot of grasses around. They don't see me. And then I have to kind of snuggle into the marsh grass and just wait. And then the birds often will come like this. I'll stop on this one when I talk about locations. This is a ruddy duck. I photograph very few ruddy ducks in this area. This bird swam inside my focal distance. And it's simply because I had really nice protection from these marsh grasses. I was well hidden. I didn't even have camouflage on. I was just literally laying on the edge near the marsh grass. And he came around the corner. And one of the best tips I can give you about locations is to find areas that have nooks and crannies, little coves, and don't go into the cove to photograph them. Go to the edges where they may eventually come around. And sometimes that can be tough because we want to approach, we see them, we know they're there, we want to go get them. But just like any other type of wildlife photography, chasing normally doesn't work. And that's going to lead us to my number one tip for waterfowl photography. And tip number one is patience. I actually believe that patience is one of the top attributes of wildlife photographers, different than many other genres of photography. It's just sometimes you have to wait for good things to happen. I've got a picture of a wood duck up on the screen. Now, this image was actually taken within the last couple of weeks, so it was fresh in my mind. And as I thought about this concept of being patient as a wildlife photographer, I remembered two encounters that I had. And it was getting up early in the morning, driving a long way, being set up and waiting for, just my neck is sore. I'm muddy, I'm cold. And I'm thinking it's time to go home. I didn't get it. But then I thought, I'm here, I'm going to wait. Fortunately for me, while the sun was rising, this was probably half an hour after sunrise. While the sun was rising, there was some haze on the horizon. So it cut the light down. I got very nice light on this, direct light, a little stronger, but very pleasing overall. And that light showed off all of the nice details. In addition to the iridescence on the head, these beautiful little breeding feathers on the back by the tail, just a gorgeous duck. And three of them actually swam by me. I heard them first and I thought I made the right decision. And they floated past the lens. They actually kind of called back and forth to each other, three males, obviously getting ready for mating season. And it paid off. In addition to getting some nice images, it was just a wonderful experience. It was one of those experiences that I really appreciate where you just get to watch behavior. So tip number one, patience, also shown here. I had literally, and I mean literally, started to pack up. And in the distance, I saw just a small duck that looked different from the others. And immediately I got back under my blind and I waited some more. Now, Wade had been at this location for well over an hour and a half. An hour and a half laying down in kind of mucky conditions. And this bird came right through. One of the great things is this is a species that I very rarely photograph. This is a greater scaup. And in this area, we don't see a lot of those. So I was able to work with a species I don't see a lot. But again, it was just waiting and being patient, like so many things. And I wonder if you can relate to this experience where you've just waited and waited and waited and thought it's not going to happen. I'm not going to get anything. And sometimes you don't, but sometimes you do. And when you do, all that time and energy pays off. Some of the best photographers I know who capture these really natural scenes and get nice intimate looks, it's simply because they have the patience to do so. So my number one tip for waterfowl photography, and you've got to remember this because there are going to be days where you want to quit, is to be patient. It won't always happen, but sometimes it will. And when it does, it's going to make up for all the other times that you waited and waited and nothing floated in front of your lens, but it will eventually happen. So those are my tips for waterfowl photography. Now, quite honestly, there's a lot more tips I could give you, and I do give some more tips over on my Patreon site. So if you haven't ever checked that out, I'll put a link in the description, but go to patreon.com/wildlifeinspired. I do things there like actually show you with my iPhone out in the field how I got to a spot, the blind setup that I use, the tripod, how it's mounted, and kind of the setup, the behind the scenes. And I do a lot of that. I've been doing a series recently with waterfowl. So there's quite a few videos on there about waterfowl photography. And on that site, I also teach you editing techniques in Photoshop, specifically for birds. So if you've got any interest in bird photography and you're still learning or take a look at my Patreon account. I would say of all of these tips, perspective, location, and patience, those are the keys to great waterfowl photography. Those locations can be so hard to come by. So it's going to take some work, but once you find them, they're repeatable. You can go to the same spots, you build a kind of a portfolio of locations that look different in the morning, look different at night, that you can get access to. Really critical. And hopefully you've got some locations in your area that you can photograph waterfowl, because again, I find it very enjoyable. It can also be extremely frustrating. In fact, I got so frustrated one year, I made a whole merchandise line called Ducks Are Assholes. I'll put a description down there. If you like to have some fun, maybe over here, I'll throw a graphic up of some of the merchandise that I do. But I think it's fun. I've had a lot of fun with the community that has purchased that merchandise and given me some feedback. And they get a lot of comments from people when they're wearing it around. So take a look at the Ducks Are Assholes merchandise. And thanks for all your support on the channel. I really enjoy doing these videos. Maybe I'll do some more of these tips specific to different types of photography, whether it's songbirds or raptors or whatever. And I've got some full-length 1-hour videos available, and waterfowl is one of those full-length videos, so you could check that out as well. I'll put a card up here. If you've got a comment, you want to drop it down below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit the little button over there and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate that. And as always, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.